it's kind of like John Cooper in the 90s. I mean, he had Ohio State flirting around with the top 10 quite a bit, but I mean, the 80s were very difficult. Late 80s, early 90s were very difficult, not even in the top 25 a lot of years. Well, then Cooper got you there to where, okay, now you're flirting around with the top 10. And what we realized was there was another gear above that to compete and win national championships. And they kind of hit that gear, at least in some regard, with Jim Tressel. And we're in that race quite a bit with Urban Meyer as well. So Michigan, I think, is probably in that second or third gear, looking to get into that gear where they're, flirting with the top 10 on a regular basis. And then the final gear where you're winning the Big Ten and contending for playoff spots in a national championship.
Steve, you don't think Cooper got there between 95 and 98?
I think if the current system were involved, then he would have had 14 playoff teams, certainly in 96, 98, and perhaps 93, maybe another year as well. But 95 possibly. They were number 4 in the country when they played Tennessee in the Citrus Bowl. So there's probably 3 of his teams would have made the top 4 and been at that level. I suppose so. It's just that we realize that to get to the very top of the mountain, there was one more gear left, and Tressel finally hit it in 2002 and kept the program at or near that level. Played for 2 more championships after that, and had a team that was a top 3 or 4 team in 2010 as well. And you're talking about a coach that did that with one set of players in 2002, another set of players in 2006 and 2007, and another set of players in 2010. To me, that's kind of like the Bobby Knight effect from when he was in his prime, that he won 3 national championships with 3 distinctly different groups of players, 76, 81, and 87. And to me, that is when it's a program and a coach, and the school and the name on the front of the jersey as much as it is anything else. So I think that Meyer, of course, had Ohio State at or near that level as well throughout his entire tenure, it seemed like. And Day has started off on the right foot at Ohio State as well. I guess I'm just saying that, for anybody who thinks Michigan is close, and I don't say this to denigrate them, they're not close. They're 2 gears away still from being at the top of the sport. And I think that's what they're aspiring to get to.
You wouldn't think that Michigan would be that far away, but I agree. Certainly, if you look at the recruiting rankings, there's a, I don't want to call it a major difference, but a decided, substantial difference between recruiting the top 3 or 4 classes in the nation and recruiting one of the 12 to 14 best classes in the nation. It's just, and then when it's repeated year after year after year after year, plus when they step on the field and it's a 4 touchdown difference one year, that might be disclaimed as a fluke, as just Ohio State was on that day and Michigan brought in what was ranked the number 1 defense. And I'm talking about the game 2 years ago in Columbus, the number 1 ranked defense in the country, that had just, by comparison, you would think, okay, well, Michigan by comparison, and if you look at game scores and results against other teams, Michigan had the better team. They had the team that, well, let me put it this way. They had the team that had the better results in 2018 than the teams Ohio State faced. Michigan performed better against the same teams, against the like opponents, than Ohio State. But then they get on the field and Ohio State's 4 touchdowns better. And then they're 4 touchdowns better again the next year. So there's no question there's a difference. And I think the difference is amplified when the intensity of the game reaches that level. It's kind of odd that Ohio State will go out against the Indianas of the world, not necessarily this past year, they beat them 51-10, but on a regular basis year to year, and will be given a decent game by the Indianas of the world and some of the teams. And I'm not even talking about Iowa and Purdue. I'm talking about week to week against some of the marginal or mid-tier teams in the Big Ten. And then they go out and they just blast Michigan. I think it's just the intensity of the game. You see it in NFL playoff games sometimes, where the intensity of the game causes the talent to be maximized, and then the superior talent really takes over when they're laser focused in that type of situation.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think that you look at some of the different games that we've seen come down the pike here, some of the different teams and different seasons, and um, you get into that a do or die type game to decide a division or decide a championship, and some crazy, strange things can happen. And certainly that was the case. The Big Ten championship game was an example of that. Ohio State had kind of rubbed Wisconsin's nose in it earlier in the season, and Wisconsin came out from like the third play of the game against Ohio State. It kind of served notice that, hey, we're going to be here for the long haul. They were up 2 touchdowns at halftime, but Ohio State showed its class. And by class, I don't mean as in being good people. I mean by saying that kind of the racing form class, that they were that good of a runner that they were able to pull through in the end. So, yeah, very much the way that you think about just competitive nature and the cream rising to the top. All those type of things typically are what we see. We saw it, I think, LSU and Clemson. I think a lot of people thought LSU was the superior team going into that game, and it didn't always look pretty. But when the fourth quarter rolled around, it was obvious and evident they had the best player and the best team on the field, and they won the game. So, 9 times out of 10, that's what it is in college football, but it is kind of a crazy sport. I mean, how does South Carolina beat Georgia? Shouldn't have even been on the same field with them, type thing. But you do see some crazy things happen from time to time.
What really impressed me about the Buckeyes' comeback against Wisconsin is that typically, the Badgers were up, I believe, 21-7. So the Buckeyes won on a 27-0 run to close out that game, win at 34-21. Typically, when you see a game like that unfold in the second half and a complete turnaround, the other team is gifting the game to the other team to a certain extent. Fumbles, tipped passes, interceptions, miscues over and over. And certainly Wisconsin made mistakes. Every team makes mistakes during a football game. There's just too much speed out there, too much hard hitting not to make mistakes. But they didn't turn the ball over. Their quarterback didn't make bad decisions and give it away. That game was just dominated at the line of scrimmage in the second half, and Ohio State's just elite athletes just took over the game without really being gifted a single point in that game. So it was impressive for the Buckeyes to come back. And even though I had personally LSU as the number 1 team in the country going into that weekend, championship weekend, I felt that the committee made a poor move in moving Ohio State based on that performance versus what LSU did against Georgia that week. Had I had Ohio State at number 1, I would have kept them number 1 based on that performance, because I think Georgia and Wisconsin pretty much proved to be very similar opponents, and I think Georgia was given way too much credit for being as good as they were. A really talented team and still are, but the committee just gave the LSU win over Georgia just way too much weight, in my opinion, to juxtapose the positions.
Yeah, I think it was understandable, and you could have made a case either way. Some metrics favored Ohio State, and some metrics favored LSU. One of the reporters who covers Ohio State was at one of the mock selection committee things, and he says, they're looking at much more than just your poll ranking and your computer ranking and different things. And they have the teams, basically all these different categories, maybe up on a computerized board or some type of board. And we've seen these type things before when you're comparing apples and oranges and these kind of things. The teams that compare favorably have a lot of greens. Then the ones that are maybe a little down the line in the category have some yellows. And then the ones that are at the bottom of the list in that particular category of that subset of teams, which it could be computer ranking 1 through 10, where 10 we think, oh, that's a great ranking. Well, in comparison to that subset of playoff teams you're considering, that's in red because they're the number 10 team. He said what had to have given them thought on Ohio State was across that board, across everything they're looking at, there had to be a lot of greens by Ohio State. And, we saw it with their offense ranking, their defense ranking, a margin of victory, all these other, things that you could put your finger on and say, even though they're in a lot of ways apples to oranges comparisons, because you're not playing the same schedule by any means. You may have one, if you're lucky, a common opponent. And his thought was, when they looked across that board, computerized or placards or whatever it was, Ohio State's categories across the line were probably green, green, yellow, green, 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 whereas LSU's were probably green, yellow, yellow, green, yellow, 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 green, green, yellow. So just very minute differences as you look across that board was what maybe led some of their thinking, and some of those things must have flipped based on what happened with the Georgia game.
Yeah, they both played great schedules and dominated those schedules, so it was a razor thin. And I'm not again, I'm not knocking the decision to rank LSU number one. I had them ranked number one. It was just the flip flop at the end of the season after the championship game.